For a moment it stopped, and released Terraspine, and then turned to face this new target. The blast continued as he channeled more and more raw power into it, keeping the blast up and pulsing it towards his target. It flexed its wings and absorbed the blast, staggering from the volume being sent its way, growing and advancing upon him. Thalasiac waited until it charged toward him, and then stepped back into the rift at the last minute, and the entity followed headlong, chasing the channeled prime energies, possibly unable to see the rift through the blinding torrent it was under. Perhaps it could not use the threads to see. Perhaps it could not see beyond what it could actually see. The entity's power spewed forth from the tear, reforming anew once more from its travel in the same way it had arrived upon the prime, and the tear was immediately sealed. Once formed, it looked upon its position and slowly turned to face Thalasiac, sensing his presence. Thalasiac steadied himself and waited for the assault he was expecting, preparing to act accordingly. "Well, it was made to hold Terraspine. It will hold you." He smiled inwardly to himself. He quickly glanced around and ensured the preparations were in place, and nodded toward the entity, holding its attention and smiling widely. "It has to." The entity readied itself and bolstered its form as it moved toward him, its power rending the very ground off this fragment of prime to raw magic as it sped forward. But Thalasiac simply stood his ground, almost beckoning it to charge. The entity did so, and hit the domed barrier hard. Had it given off a sound, it would have sounded like 100 thunderstorms, but as it was magic, it merely sent crashes of waves into the threads as they flexed and restrained his power under the weave. It paused and took in its surroundings, and then realized it was encircled, and with that began thrashing around on the barrier, trying to force its way through, to pierce it in some small fashion. Again the weave flexed and held him back, but Thalasiac noticed that the onslaught was more than he had bargained for, as a thread or two had buckled under the strain, and he quickly manipulated the magics and reknitted them, strengthening others that were straining as he did. He had its attention, and it was trying to force its way through the barriers, the seals, the wardings, to get hold of him. For one of the few times in his long existence, Thalasiac actually felt fear, and dreaded to think what this entity would do if it managed to reach him after seeing what it had done to Spine with a simple touch. It was then that the plan came to play in full, and his ally made its presence known. A gigantic beast, towering over his own form, faded into view, and approached until it settled to stand behind him, dwarfing his form. The host of the wild had arrived. Slowly it began to howl, a low moan at first, raising in pitch and volume. It became deafening to any mortals that would have been listening, and it carried with it the very words of power of the wild, to encapsulate the dome and strengthen it even further. The entity thrashed and lashed out against the barrier, and it began to show cracks from the assault, but held fast, and the wild continued the howl. Thalasiac began the final incantations, and the entity realized something was happening, and spread its claws wide and dug into the barriers as the ground beneath him cracked and buckled before falling away. Beneath the entity lay the swirling, inky darkness of a portal through the very void itself, and it desperately clawed at the now shrinking barrier that began to force it down into the path to its prison. The wild moved from a howl to a roar as it placed its gigantic paws upon the barrier and pushed it into the floor, forcing the entity into the prison they had created, and removing the purchase it had been using to not fall. Unearthly sounds arose from the hole, but the magic prevented any form of hearing, and once the wild had sealed the first protective layer with a white light, nothing could be seen either. That was it. This seemingly unstoppable entity was encased in a prison of their design, and it had only taken several thousand years to construct. Only. It had been a labor of pain and loss, with many souls lost to the effort, but it had all been worth it to secure this thing. even if it had not been the intended target, for this was a more dire threat than the spine had ever been. The gods were safe from this threat, beyond its reach and sheer power. Was this thing daemon, or something else? Something new? Surely this was of the source, but the power, the sheer capacity for devastation. It had been like nothing witnessed before. Had the source sent it to remove Terraspine, as well as the host, in one sweep of his will? Thalasiak backed away from the trap, catching his breath for a moment, watching his ally. The wild began to create something anew atop the white light. The light was pushed down into the ground, sinking 100 feet or more, and then the wild knelt at the edge of the vast hollow in the ground and glanced at Thalasiak, giving him an apologetic look. Thalasiak cocked his head and approached to discover what was happening, for this was something new and not part of their plan. The wild calmed itself and bowed its head to Thalasiak in thanks, letting him know that his service to the gods was acknowledged, and lifted a paw to the skies. Thalasiak nodded in return, but seemed puzzled. "We have done what we came here to do. It is over, old friend, at least for this battle," he said, and moved forward to place his hands upon the wild's arm, but stopped when he saw the light shine down from the skies, illuminating this behemoth, and with that the wild's raised hand extended, and with a sudden movement claws emerged, huge silvered claws. "No!" Thalasiak cried out, as he feared the worst, and tried to get in the way, but the wild was either too fast or simply knew he would try to stop him. It moved before he had the chance to act, and plunged the claws into its own chest, letting out a bestial scream that left Thalasiak stunned, reeling from the emotional overload and the outbreak of power, as the divine husk of his ally was torn open. Divine energies gushed out from the wound, and the wild struck again and again until it drew from its chest a beating light of silver, a heart of pure life. Thalasiak could not move, stunned quite literally, and he could only watch as the wild took its form and spilled its life essence into the hollow, slowly filling it with its very existence. Words and images were abound in his head, and it was then he understood why this was happening. "You did all you could, friend to the lights, but you can do no more. Now it is my turn to do what must be done. This must be in order to prevent the ravagings of the primes, and eventually the very gods themselves. My own essence, my own divinity, will be pulled here, and wherever those upon the primes follow the wild, they will empower this seal with their own knowledge and power. Their worship of my truth will forever strengthen this seal, ensuring that this seal can never be broken as long as one of mine walks upon the primes, and hence the destroyer may never be pulled from this place. The destroyer will remain locked behind this door until such a time as I am removed from this place." He paused before finishing. "Or I am ready to confront them." The wild turned toward Thalasiak and smiled weakly as it lay down, dropping its enormous bulk to the floor, allowing its body to continue to bleed into the growing pool. Thalasiak had to shield his eyes, as he found he was unable to move, as the sheer brilliance of the power from the pool was more than even he could handle. He cradled his ally's head in his many hands, and stroked the form of his dying friend of eons past. He did not shed a tear, as his kind were incapable of such, but instead he let flow magic from his hands, trying to ease the passing of the fallen. He was overtook with loss as the light slowly began to seep from their body. An image appeared within his head of Terraspine, and he understood what was being asked of him. He would finish what they believed had to be done, what they had set out to do. This trap was meant for him, not for this unfathomable entity, but he will make his pain known. He will channel all he had left, and all he could take. He would confront Terraspine now, before they lost the power to do so. As he moved his weakened form to leave, his fallen friends raised a claw to touch him, and a silvered light flowed into him from his fallen friend's form, and he had never felt such power. The Wild had gifted him that which he needed to accomplish their wishes, and he would do it, for the Fallen. His body surged with raw energies, and he blinked from reality.